Today's episode is a particularly long one where we're going to talk with two authors from Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza, Bruce Fisk and Daniel Bannoura. This is a conversation where we're going to go through from the Palestinian perspective of what it has been like interacting with Israel. These are both Christian theologians who are thinking about, have been actively involved. They pulled together a bunch of people who have been very involved in Christ at the Checkpoint and various Christian advocacy movements for Palestinian Christians and the Palestinian people. This will be a long and extended conversation. I drilled down, I pushed back on some things. They pushed back on some things for me and corrected me where they thought I was speaking incorrectly. And so it's really to kind of give you a taste of all the things that Palestinians are thinking and seeing from within the land of the Palestinian territories and Israel. Okay, we will also have a response from Robert Nicholson, who is going to give kind of his view from a pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian, he would say. He's pro-both, and I think everybody involved in these conversations would say they are both pro-Israel, the Israeli people, pro-Palestinian, the Palestinian people. So it's going to be a long conversation. We're going to go down some rabbit trails. I have lots of random thoughts. I learned a lot from both reading the book and talking to them. And so I'm very grateful for this time. And I think I understand so much better many of the little things I've heard here and there, or many of the arguments that kind of get thrown out there. A lot of them make a lot more sense to me after this conversation. So if you like what we do for the Center for Hebraic Thought and the Biblical Mind, you can like and subscribe. You can give us that 5-star rating that we're always looking for on your podcast feed. And if you want to give to us, we will work with you on that one. You can give recurring gifts or single gifts at thebiblicalmind.org/give. Now on to part 1 of our discussion of being Christian after the desolation of Gaza.
This is the Biblical Mind podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
It's not the Israel-Gaza conflict. It's a reality for 150 years of Jewish and Western Jewish, what we call now Zionist ambitions in Palestine, that have rendered the Palestinians insignificant and an obstacle for Jewish domination over Palestine. So that led to catastrophic things and events that decimated the Palestinian society and made the majority of us Palestinians as refugees who cannot go back to the land. And also specifically because I'm a Palestinian Christian and a theologian and a scholar in Christianity and the history of the Middle East, devastated the Christian population in Palestine, where the majority of us have become refugees who cannot go back to Palestine. Complete eradication of Christian villages in the north, in the Galilee, massive numbers of Christians who have left the land since then, whether in the West Bank, whether in Gaza. Gaza right now is almost empty of all Christians, also Christians in what is today Israel. So to reduce it to Israel and Gaza conflict takes away from a very entrenched, problematic reality of domination, of what we can call now ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948, that pushed the Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinians, out of the land to create a Jewish homeland. And what is now described in Gaza as a genocide, as a collective punishment and an eradication of life in Gaza. So there's a lot to say about the history, the politics, but also for us as theologians here, how theology, how the scriptures have been weaponized, rather than the Bible as a text of goodness and of God's mercy and love for humanity. Now it's become a political tool to justify what I just described. And now anyone, Mike Huckabee to Ted Cruz, you name it, could easily wield the Bible as a weapon to justify the suffering of the Palestinians. So that's the biggest thing, is like we have to unpack all of these things that are at play. And this is the saddest reality, that have made Christians, whether scholars and theologians and Bible scholars, all the way to the parishioners and the lay people, complicit in the suffering of Palestinians. because it's their faith now has been used to justify all of that. So all of these things have to be tackled, and there's a lot of propaganda, sorry to say, and also anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab and anti-Muslim bigotry that have informed a lot of the ways that Christians, and especially Western Christians, especially American Christians, how they thought about the Middle East and how they thought about this issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. Everybody always says, well, we have to look at the historical context, right, when we deal with this issue, and because it is thick and it's difficult, and you both have propaganda on all sides, and you have true stories on all sides, and it's very difficult to separate those out. And also, you just have on the ground realities where people just see things from their village, from their perspective. Right. So, Bruce, I wonder if you could tell that same story, but how would an Israeli tell that story? Where would the points of tension or difference be?
Can I just tag on something? Let me first tag on something that relates to your first question. Something that Daniel didn't mention was, I think that I run into a lot, the either naive or uninformed conflation of Jews with Israel. So the ancient people or the modern Jew is, you could call them a nation, a religion, an ethnicity. People go around on those questions of how to define a Jew, but that needs to be separated, doesn't it, from a nation state, a modern political entity that has come into being with the rise of many other nation states. And so we have, I think, a default sympathy as evangelicals and as Christians for Jews, but now this maybe predisposition or orientation has been mapped onto a state such that when the state behaves in certain ways, it becomes inappropriate or unspiritual or in other ways wrong to criticize the state. And there's this this obvious, serious effort on the part of Israel and many to equate Israel with the Jew. Israel calls itself the Jewish state or the nation state for the Jewish people. And what we see then is this notion that any criticism of the state and its behavior, its government, its military, etc., becomes anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. So that's another thing that I see as constantly, encountered in my conversations. If you want,
can I stop you there?
Could you repeat the question?
I'll go to that next question. That kind of what an Israeli perspective would be on the same, but kind of pulling what I'm hearing in both of your answers is things that I think. Well, when I run into people, and I say that things that I think are just basic facts about Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, and you realize people don't know very basic things like. Daniel, you talked about Christians and Palestinians in the same breath, and I think most Christians in the West don't know that most of the Christians in Israel are Arab and Palestinian. And then on the flip side, most people do not know that most Israelis are not super religious folks. I always say pick a crunchy granola, liberal desert person in California. And that's like that in my mind, and make them from North Africa, and that's your typical Israeli, right? So really, just like almost like a complete lack of contact with the actual people who live in these places and what they do and what they believe and what their personal hurdles are. So yeah, maybe I could now have you kind of tell us you know lots of people in the area. You've heard all the different variations on the story. What's going to be the typical variation of the story that an Israeli is going to tell you from 1890 forward or something like that?
I can start.
Israeli Jew, I should clarify.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So 80% of Israel proper is Jewish, and the other 20% or so are, most of the other 20% are Arab Palestinians or Israeli Arabs, if you want to call them. So Israeli Jews have been raised on a certain narrative, parts of which have, credibility in my mind, and other parts need to be challenged. We all have our national mythologies. I think at the core of the Israeli national myth is the the notion that we can't trust anyone else. Israeli Jews are only to trust themselves. And so whatever treaties might be signed, whatever alliances might be formed, none of that is stable and fixed. And at some point, the world's going to turn on us. So that's hardwired into them. And then I'm always struck when I travel in the Jewish areas of Israel-Palestine at I want to say the ignorance of Jews of their Arab and Palestinian neighbors. Like they really don't have much contact. I remember being at a Shabbat dinner, and in attendance were some of my students who happened to be Egyptian. So they were Arabic-speaking Egyptians. And the family, this Jewish family, was so excited to have Arabs that they could talk to, practice their Arabic with them over dinner, when next door to them and just down the street were Arabic speakers, but they didn't have any contact with them. They had no relationship with them. Now, that's, of course, one story, but there's just a huge divide so that the myths, the propaganda, the suspicions, the fears that circulate don't get challenged by relationships. So when I encounter Jews in Jerusalem who tell me that Arabs want to cut their throats, my only response is, come with me. Let me come with me, and I'll introduce you to some of my friends, because they don't have that opportunity or they don't take that opportunity. So ignorance, fear, and a sense of isolation, I think, has bred the kind of mentality that has given rise to the sort of disproportionate responses, the brutality, the sort of justified militarization of the society in order to keep themselves safe. They're on this quest for security, and somehow they think that the only way to do that is through the so-called iron wall or the iron fist. Daniel, what are you going to add to that?
No, thanks, Bruce. I totally understand the Jewish narrative, or the Israeli narrative specifically, of this kind of belonging and going back to Jerusalem, the whole spiritual legacy that they inherited of that land, of the stories of David and Solomon and the prophets and so on. And it's fair and it's beautiful, and I can resonate with it as a Christian myself. The problem is that how those stories are being utilized today. How do we think about David today? Should we vanquish the enemies? Who's Joshua today, right? Should we, bash the heads of babies, and that's kind of the language that was used. If Drew, if you kind of paid attention to the rhetoric used by Christians and Israelis about the Amalekites, and how the biblical narrative has been used not to justify the erasure of the Amalekites in the Hebrew scriptures are now it's like being used in Gaza. So I totally get that, and I sympathize with it. There's a nasty legacy of antisemitism that has animated Jewish thinking towards the other, to Bruce's point, that made it very hostile and based on suspicion and fear. My problem is that how that translated, especially through Christian Zionism and Christian support for the Jewish people, that is now coming at my expense. So now I have to pay for the sins of white European Christians who, victimized Jews for 2,000 years. So that's kind of the issue there. So I sympathize with all of that. On the other hand, that is also coupled by the hostility towards Arabs, who are seen as other, as seen as less than and uncivilized. And therefore, to your point, Drew, about, people are just finding out about Christian Palestinians. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, we've been around for 2,000 years. We've been Christians before your ancestors, your pagan ancestors became Christians, right? But why don't you know about
assumptions about me? But yes,
I'm assuming that your European ancestors at some point were pagan. But you know what I'm saying? Like, why wouldn't you know about the rich, beautiful legacy of Christians in the Middle East? But that's part of, we mentioned propaganda, right? But that's part of the brainwashing. We are the good guys. We're the Christians in the West. We're the good guys, and those scary brown people in the Middle East are the bad guys. And it's okay if we can take over the land and colonize it. It's okay if we drive the Palestinians out. But so what do you do with the Palestinian Christians? You gotta lump them together with the bad guys.
Yeah.
So how do you do this? You basically ignore them. Like there are no Palestinian Christians. There are no. So that's an easy move to create that simple binary between the good guys, us, and the bad guys, them. And if you do that, if you create that simple binary, then you can do anything you want with the bad people. You can destroy all of Gaza because these are bad people. And we saw this. I'll just kind of give an anecdote here. There's been obviously a lot of outcry because of what we saw happening in Gaza. But every time Christians are killed in Gaza, for example, there was a strike on a Catholic church that killed 3 Christians in Gaza. And that's when the uproar in the media, and I think President Trump called Netanyahu and scolded him for killing Christians. But then on every day you're killing Muslims. But there's the same kind of moral clarity and concern for the livelihood of people doesn't show up when it comes to Muslims. So there's this kind of very latent bias that exists. If Gazans were white Ukrainians or Christians, you would not see what we saw in Gaza.
Yeah.
So obviously there's something there that is embedded in our psyche, in our ways of thinking about the other, that has justified not just what happened in Gaza, but 100 years of this issue between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Yeah, I've heard even journalists say that if you look at the coverage and some of the critical edge, and of course you guys know better than anybody that some of the deepest critiques of Israel come from within Israel. But speaking of the coverage, there's this kind of overt chastisement of Israel, but no chastisement of Gaza at all, or Hamas at least. And the subtext there is, well, they're just barbarians. Of course, they're going to act like that, right? But Israel should know better. They're this better foe or something like that. So there's all kinds of weird ways in which this might be instantiated into our thinking. I did actually write down one. It's not even a question. It's just a thought, because. I'm a combat veteran myself, as people who listen to this podcast are probably sick of me saying. So my dad was a Vietnam vet. My uncles were all in World War II. I'm very experienced. I did 9 combat deployments down to Colombia in the 90s. So I'm very experienced with regional wars. From a ground perspective, I was just at one forward operating base, so I don't know everything that was going on. I'm interested in, this is just a thought that's been brewing in my head for the last few weeks, that for a lot of Christians and not, people who are interested in this area or have lay interest in some way, like they just don't understand conflict, right? Like they don't understand regional conflicts. And so it's kind of like when college students on their student evals, which you can all sympathize with, on their student evals, they'll complain about things. You're like, well, yeah, that's not just this college. You go to any college, you're going to complain about that because that's what all colleges do. And I wonder how much the kind of lack of knowledge about how regional wars work and regional conflicts work kind of drives a lot of the ignorance engine in this discussion as well, from your perspective.
Oh, I have a different. Yeah, so Drew, I have a very different position as a person from the Middle East who have been on the receiving end of American and Western imperialism throughout history. And so I have a lot of things to say that would be critical of how the U.S. has been thinking and dealing with the Middle East and the support of Israel that has basically destabilized the region for over the last 80 years. But also, Drew, I want to also push back and realize that conflicts do not happen in a vacuum. And for example, when we think of Iran, we should not assume that Iran had forgotten about 1953 when the CIA and the British intelligence overthrew a democratic elected president or prime minister to install the Shah, who brought so much corruption and violence into Iran. Right? So things do not happen in a vacuum, and we have to understand that long legacy of interventionism, of imperialism, and the destruction of Iraq recently that still is still very live in people's imagination. And for the vast majority of the region, the Arab world or the Muslim majority world, Israel, that sticky issue. You tell us democracy is important. You tell us that you are the good people. You follow human rights. You are free people. But then why do you support Israel, a force that has destroyed the Palestinian people, has taken land from Lebanon, from Syria, is taking more land from Lebanon right now, is taking more land from Syria over the last 2 years, and also has destroyed the Palestinian people. So there is a sense in the Middle East, in those nations, of this legacy of Orientalism and imperialism that really really puts them at edge, but also current affairs and how the U.S. thinks about the Middle East has really made this very complicated and very messy. And so, not to justify any of these actions, we should not be surprised if ISIS come to the fore when you destabilize them, Iraq. Don't expect Hamas. Don't be surprised that Hamas would come to the fore when there's this unconditional support for Israel at the expense of the Palestinians. Just like the ANC in South Africa should not have been surprising or shocking to us. Just like slave revolts in the U.S. should not have happened, or just like Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire would have been surprising to the Roman soldiers, right? So we have to understand that legacy of oppression and denial of freedoms and rights leads to violence and leads to resistance. And that's what you have happening in the Middle East and North Africa. And there's a laundry list of stories and countries and nations destroyed because of that legacy of colonialism and imperialism.
Yeah, it is an area literally overlaid with imperialism. I mean, like you said, going back to the Roman Empire, the Muslim empires, right? They were colonialists who came out. I mean, none of the people from that region are Arab, right? By nature, right? That they've all become Arab because of imperial powers. Yeah. So I wonder how you do parse out, how do you help people? Because we have the same thing in the United States with indigenous people, right? We talk about lands taken from certain indigenous people, and then we have to go, well, yeah, but they took it from somebody else, and they took it from somebody else, and there's this chain of being of local conflicts that turn regional and national in some cases. So where do we, as Christians, we always say there's this deep history. Well, where does that history begin, and how do we place ourselves in that history? Do we, the one option is you just say, well, this is where things are today, status quo, let's go from here, right? But I'm hearing you say that's not going to really help.
Yeah, there's a lot to say there. So, I mean, as a Christian, of course, my ancestors were very confused and angry when Muslim invaders came over and took over the land, and they forced taxes on the people, right? But after a few generations and a few centuries, well, okay, Muslims are not my neighbors, and they're kind of nice people. And maybe I speak Arabic with them. I still speak Greek or Syriac, but we're fine, And then they become your neighbors, and then you just have to love your neighbors. You still have to get along, and you're gonna buy your tomatoes from somewhere, So you're gonna buy it from your neighbor, from the farmer next door. So yeah, I mean, the history develops obviously, and there are a lot of developments and fascinating kind of rich histories that exist in the Middle East that deserve some reflection on just a robust and beautiful interaction between Muslims and Christians and Jews in the Middle East. There's some tension, obviously, but for the most part, you move towards a sense of neighborliness and equality, and hopefully move towards democracy and equal representation. Moving now, but look at this moment here when you have a system for now, what is described as a system of a two-tiered legal system between Jews who rule over the land and Palestinians who are second or third class citizens, or not even citizens, residents. We know that this is unethical. We know that those systems of hierarchy and racism and apartheid are unacceptable. We can go back to Abraham and cherry pick, Genesis 12, but are we choosing peace? Are we choosing equality? Are we choosing dignity and humanity are we choosing equality under the law? Or are we saying, because of Genesis 12 or Genesis 15 or Ezekiel 36, therefore I'm going to take over the land of the Palestinians and build a settlement, right? So I think there's some basic foundational laws that we know that exist: international law, human rights, Geneva Conventions, UN resolutions, just basic laws of equality and neighbor love that should dictate how we think. That's the current system that exists today. You don't have to go back 100 years, to your point, Drew. Today is a system, just go to the land and you can see it. It's a system of systemic racism and segregation. And like I said, now it's been declared by all major human rights organizations to be a system of apartheid, similar to Jim Crow America, similar to South Africa. So this is very obvious to anyone who goes and sees the land, visits with Palestinians, sees the walls and the checkpoints and the annexation of land. This is a very obvious unjust system. So we can discuss history all you want, and I'm here for it. But at the same time, as Christians who supposedly love their neighbors, love their enemies, whatever that means to us today, because now we love to kill our enemies as Christians. If you love your enemies, surely you would want to pay attention and listen to their stories and understand that a system of hierarchies and racism and segregation is not right. And if you follow Jesus, then surely you want to be on the side of justice and mercy and goodness, and not on the side of power and domination. So this should be easy, Drew. I hope. Obviously, it's not easy for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But that for me, and I'll stop here, and maybe Bruce could jump in now. That's been the most heartbreaking thing for me as a Christian when I see my siblings in the faith who are the forefronts of justifying such blatant, obvious, what we can call in Christian language, evil. And it's obvious. But why is it the Christian who supposedly are so better than Muslims because they love their neighbors are so ready to call for war and to justify war using the Bible? That's been like the most tragic thing. And I think that's what the work of the book that was published, and we're kind of slightly tangentially discussing here, that's why this book was so important. What do we do as Christians when we saw so much destruction in Gaza?
That's good. I want to come back to Jim Crow, but Bruce, did you want to hop in here? And because he's kind of addressing some of what you said about the fundamental fear in Israeli society creates all of spin out effects and the kinds of. Well, anyways, you want to hop in here?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of points. One has to do with the Christian fear post 9/11 of Islam, which has just accelerated exponentially. So we've got now a Christian population in North America and lots of places which has a fundamental distrust of Islam as a religion, and then is Muslim practitioners, and some kind of conflation of Islam with Islamism or with militant Islam. All of that sort of pairs nicely with an eschatological or an apocalyptic perspective that many of these same Christians hold, that sees themselves somehow, because of 1948 and the establishment of Israel, because of 1967 and the claiming by Israel of the Temple Mount, confirms to many of these folk that we're watching the kind of last days unfold. And the last days, if you read literally, and I would argue incorrectly, the book of Revelation, it's not a time for sissies. People get hurt. And so, it sucks for Daniel and other Palestinian Christians who happen to be in the war zone. They just need to get out of the way because, the Antichrist or the devil or God or somebody's up to something in that part of the world. And, war is a time when people get hurt. So I'm sympathetic towards you, but you need to recognize that you're, part of something much bigger. So that kind of, that's not all Christian Zionism. That's not all Western Christians and evangelicals. But it's certainly a piece of it. So you've got this anti-Muslim sentiment. You talked about, Daniel, historical context for why some of these things happen and the importance of that. But then you also, I thought, rightly pointed to the present reality. And, we could argue, and there are really smart people, and I think people of goodwill who are writing books that really they collide in terms of explaining the history. I've done enough reading to be persuaded of certain accounts and certain evidence, but there are people that have read the story of the last 120 years and have concluded, certain things that are essentially Zionist or a certain type of Zionism. And okay, so we could debate that. And if we really are serious, we should do our homework and sit down together and talk. But even having done that, we can look around us today at what is happening, the legal regime that's in place, the militarization, the impact on civilians, non-combatants, non-participants, and all of that. And it's just very easy for me to conclude that whatever past narrative you embrace, the present is not sustainable and is certainly not defensible. And so, sure, let's have our arguments about whether the Arab nations around Israel were, out to get Israel in 1948. I'm happy to have that debate with you, but look around you today, as Daniel said, and that's when it seems to me a little bit more clear. To which Israelis would respond, yeah, it sucks for Palestinians, but this is the unavoidable necessity if we're going to ensure our security. To which I would respond, you're not becoming more secure the way you're going about this. And I think, if anything, October 2023 showed that very, very clearly.
So the problem is I don't write any questions ahead of time, so I just can't think of it. But I've got so many questions. I want us at some point to define Zionism minimalistically, if we can. The us versus them thing that keeps coming up here is, and I noticed it after October 7th. I go to Israel fairly regularly. I used to work for a think tank over there. What I noticed, and I'd be interested to see if you saw the same thing in your Israeli friends, it shifted from it really sucks for Palestinians. I wish this weren't the case. We know lots of Palestinians. We know this is not the way it's supposed to be. And then after October 7th, those same people were saying it's their kids or my kids, and I'm choosing my kids. And that was it. Like there wasn't even a discussion to be had. And again, I get it. I understand why that, but I thought that's not a sustainable position, as you said. That cannot carry you through. And we've even seen the deleterious nature of that in policing in America. When police take the mentality of good guys and bad guys, when you take combat zone mentality out on the streets, it's always going to end poorly for somebody, usually not the police officer. So sorry, that was me ranting. But I do want to define the word Zionism, because the first time I went to Israel for an academic conference, I wasn't even sure what Zionism was. I wasn't that interested, but at some point I said, can somebody define this? And literally the guy who's a good friend of mine now, he said, look over that hill. You just see a hill and you think there's a backside of the hill. When we look at that hill, we see armies waiting to invade us. That was literally his definition of Zionism. And he didn't mean it in a good way. He just meant that's the psyche that drives this kind of thing. I want you to push back and tell me why this is wrong, or maybe why you think it's okay. In my mind, if you believe that the Jewish people who are in Israel right now, whether they're boo Jews or whether they're atheist Jews or religious Jews, if you don't think they should be killed or run out of the land, then you're some form of Zionist, because I don't know what other word to put there, that you believe they actually should exist there in some way. And then now we're talking about what degrees, what theologies, or what political philosophies fund them. How are you using the word Zionism, and where would it be different from that kind of a simplistic continuum?
I'll maybe Bruce could answer that question. I'll give it a try as well. But before I do that, I want to just push back, Dru, on your language, and I mean this in a very kind way.
You don't have to be kind.
I'll be kind, but I'll be firm.
Yeah.
I'll be firm.
Yeah.
The language that I've been to Israel multiple times, I get why you would say that, but that language unintentionally erases the other people. versus the Palestinians. When you go to Tel Aviv, for example, that is the site of what is called Jaffa for the Palestinians.
Yeah.
When you go to Jerusalem, that's an illegally occupied city of the Palestinian people, right? So I get that is part of the parlance, but that language in many ways is violent towards Palestinians because it erases them. They become an insignificant minority, like the natives of this country, right? We don't talk about them, right? They're just there in their own reservations,
right?
Right.
Well, I'm from Oklahoma, so as part of my upbringing, the indigenous people,
yeah. There you go. So I think we just have to be intentional. Both people call that place home. I, as a Palestinian, for me, that's just Palestine. That's
right.
There is a legacy of a place called Palestine that is inclusive to Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims. That's historically Palestine.
Well, it's what it was called by Jews up until the 20th century. Yeah.
Before 1948, every map you open, even today, every textbook you open, biblical scriptures, like this is Palestine. So, but that language we use is intentionally or unintentionally, I think for most people it's unintentional, but for those in power, it's very intentional to erase the Palestinians. If it is us, Israel, well, what are these people like yelling about? It's Israel. So I think we just have to be careful. So we can just humanize both people and say Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine. You're holding those two things in tension because they are in tension, and you're humanizing both people who claim that place to be home for them. So I thought I would. I think
it's a good clarification. I don't know if I buy it, but I get it. Only because I was speaking geographically. Like I lived in Israel, the geographic state of Israel, recognized by the UN. I traveled to the West Bank quite often. I have friends in the West Bank and in Gaza. We've had Gazans on this podcast. Khalil Sayeg. I don't know if you know Khalil, but
Then Drew, then I would say there's work you have to do in being in Palestine. So you can go to Israel and not see the Palestinian or not see the Palestinian story, the Palestinian history. You've been to Israel many times, but you never visited an ethnically cleansed village in the north of the Galilee, right? You never spent time with Palestinians like in Haifa or in Beersheba. So there's that kind of work that you have to do when you go to Israel. Maybe you have to also to step, off the tour bus and spend more.
I've never been on a tour bus in Israel except with students. I've only lived there and traveled independently.
Sure. The point is that intentionality in meeting the people who have been there for generations and generations. That our academic programs, our churches, and our conferences ignore because they don't fit into whatever project we're working on, right? So I think there's work that you and others have to do in maybe spending more time in Bethlehem than in Tel Aviv and see what that does to you, the way that you think about Israel and Palestine.
Well, I think I have spent more time in Bethlehem than Tel Aviv that's great. By the count of it, yes.
I'm talking to the general audience here. Who been done that.
I get the point. What's that? Yeah, Zionism. And I think this is where Zionism becomes because Zionism determines what we are calling the places who have the right to be there and how should they be there. And without getting into two-state or one-state solutions, because I'm not, unless it's helpful for thinking about it, what is a minimalist definition of Zionism that gets us to at least figure out what we do and don't agree with?
I could take a crack at that. Clearly, the term has evolved over time. So when you ask that question, you're partly asking, what Zionism was around when. And of course, there were competing definitions of Zionism during the last century.
Right.
I would say, to answer it minimalistically, that the form of Zionism that has won today, the regnant, the dominant Zionism today, is much more than what you just said. Which your working definition was anybody who is willing to tolerate or even celebrate Jews in the land. Something like that was, I think, your
tolerate would be the minimal. Yeah.
I think the way the term has evolved and the version of it that has emerged is that it's much more than presence in the land; it's hegemony over the land. So that involves military power, that involves legal constraints, and of course that involves a demographic majority, right? 70-30 or an 80-20 Jewish domination. And that's precisely why Israel hasn't declared its borders all the way over to the Jordan River, because then they would have inherited millions of Palestinians that they don't want to include and grant citizenship to. Why? Because Zionism as conceived requires hegemony and control and domination. So that's the way I'm using the term. So you can be, if you're anti-Zionist in that sense, you're somebody who says, I'm not going to support a state project that privileges one people and insists on the legal superiority of one people, that insists on the demographic majority of one people. I'm just not on board with that. I don't support those notions, whether it's in Israel or anywhere else. I would not support a white America for the very same reasons. So that's my
or
notion
Muslim
of
with
anti-Zionism.
or
It
like
has,
same
it
thing.
has nothing to do with it has nothing to do with whether there are Jews in the land or how many Jews are in the land. It has to do with the structures that surround them, support them, and preserve their control.
Yeah, there have always been Jews in Palestine, historically speaking. A lot of Jewish migrants came from Europe, and they came alongside the Palestinians, and it was fine. I think it's when 48, when you take over the land and push the people out, that's when Zionism becomes a problematic ideology. I would go further from Bruce, and I would say Zionism is just a form of Jewish supremacy. It's a belief that Jews have to be supreme in the land. Yeah. How do you establish a Jewish state? Where? Like, how do you do it and where? Upon whose land? If you're coming from Ukraine or Brooklyn or Russia or Germany to Palestine to establish Israel through Zionism, then by definition, you're going to take over someone else's land or someone else's homes, right? So, yeah, sure, Jews could live in the land, but how do you live? How did you come into the land, and how do you live today in that land? So these are the questions we have to interrogate. And the majority of Jews in the early 20th century refused that Zionist project. Eventually, Zionism won the day, and especially a very aggressive form of Jewish settlement won the day. Just that is, to Bruce's point, is very aggressive and very intolerant and frankly very dismissive and harmful towards the indigenous population. That's the issue here. So you have a lot of incredible and beautiful anti-Zionist Jews who are saying, I yearn to go to Jerusalem next year when I do my Passover, but I know that I need to live in justice and mercy with my neighbor. And therefore, I reject Zionism. And it's actually an affront to my Judaism.
Right.
So it's the same legacy, the same history, the same faith, but it's saying that Zionism as an ideology is antithetical to my Jewish belief.
Right. Yeah, and of course, Zionism, what you guys know, with Herzl and the kibbutzniks, you have all kinds of people who are participating in all kinds of Zionist projects. But again, I think that's one of the things that most Christians have no idea about, right? They're shocked that it's, that it's Marxist communists who were actually attacked on October 7th, right? The very people who you would think would be the last people you would, they're already sympathetic and on the side of many people. So that's really helpful to help thinking about Zionism. And now I think thinking about practical realities on the ground. Let's go post October 7th to get through your book picked up and you'll get it right. Being Christian after the desolation of Gaza. And before we talk about Gaza, I actually want to talk about something completely outside of Gaza, which is settler violence against Palestinian villages has shot up in the last 2 years, right? It's gone gangbusters. There doesn't even seem to be, now I have not kept close eye on the most recent things, but for a long time, there doesn't seem to be any police or military control of the settlers. It was almost like we're going to ignore that because it looks small. I see that as a really potential, like a really bad thing going on that doesn't look like that big of a deal for a lot of people, because you think, oh, it's just people going and burning a house down or something somewhere. What do you guys think that's a big deal, or is that like a sideshow?
I think it's a huge deal. I think it's not new though. I mean, as you say, the rates have increased, the acceleration, the boldness, the aggressiveness, and the state sponsorship have all sort of increased dramatically. But, I've been going back and forth and leading student groups and living in Palestine since the Second Intifada, and it's been there all along. I can remember probably this was like 2006. I was at a village that was demonstrating because the root of the wall was taking some of their land. And as part of the day's events, there was there was a soccer game, and there were internationals there from Italy, from France, from everywhere. So young guys in their 20s, and we set up a soccer game between them and the local Palestinian kids. And this was going on in just a farmer's field, nowhere near the wall. And the wall wasn't built yet, but nowhere near the boundary. And so we're having a wonderful time. I'm just watching. I'm not participating, but it's just a big festive occasion. And these folk in a military jeep pull up along a road, a rim road along against the barrier, and they just shot tear gas into the middle of our soccer game. Now, those weren't settlers, I suppose. Those were soldiers. But either way, this was behavior that was completely uncalled for. There was nobody throwing any rocks. I was there. I witnessed this whole thing, and I was one of the ones who got gassed. This kind of behavior with the state's support is not new. What we see with Ben-Gvir, with Smotrich, even with Netanyahu, is a new level, and it's rising to horrific heights. But it would be a misunderstanding to think that the settler violence is, just a result of October 7th. That said, there are also many settlers who don't even know they're in the West Bank. They're there because the government, provides subsidies, and it's a nice little hilltop village close to Tel Aviv. Or they're there because they're hippies that want to get in touch with the land of their ancestors, but they don't really have any political agenda. So there's all different kinds of settlers. Israel is a very diverse society. But the idea that this project is just a few bad apples or a couple of kids or a few hundred kids that are, out of control, who always get caught and get prosecuted, like you hear from people like Mike Huckabee, is nonsense. It's just nonsense. It's a systemic problem that's getting a lot worse. And I'm sure Daniel, you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean that's my upbringing in Bethlehem. That's what we always experience, whether it's the settlers, whether it's Israeli soldiers, whether it's violence from the settlers, whether it's kidnapping of Palestinians, the shooting of my cousin, my dad, a Palestinian pastor, being arrested 5 times, my neighbor who was killed. Like this is very common for us as Palestinians. There's my concern with this kind of, this is a recent thing that is happening, is we tend to exceptionalize certain things. Like we exceptionalize Netanyahu to being right wing, we exceptionalize Gvir and Smotrich, or what's happening with the settlers now. This, for us as Palestinians who have been on the receiving end of this is not new. Yes, there is an increase in the severity and the frequency, but this is the natural outgrowth of to our previous conversation of Zionism. If you believe the West Bank, or what you call Judea and Samaria, to be your land, then who are these people who are squatting on your land? God gave it to you. Why would you consider them anything but less than, and therefore you can beat them up, you can attack them, right? So that is what Jewish supremacy looks like practically. It's always been there, Dru, so we have to be very careful. This is not about Netanyahu or his government. This is what Zionism looks like practically. What has changed, Dru, is because of the devastation of Gaza, there's been more interest to pay attention to what's happening to the Palestinians. So you see an increase in that footage, social media as well. You always have content coming out of the West Bank and Gaza. So media agencies respond to that content. That content was not available 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So there's a shift in media. There's a shift in empathy towards, or sympathy towards, the Palestinians. Maybe not empathy, but maybe some kind of sympathy that would want to highlight that. So you have the New York Times now talking about the rape of Palestinian prisoners, which was like a huge outcry. But as far as I remember, Palestinians have always been abused in Israeli soldiers. I've been assaulted at a checkpoint, physically myself, right? But that's always been part of our story. But now suddenly people are paying attention to it.
Well, and that helps put it into focus for me, because I was thinking, well, the only reason I actually saw any of the settler violence stuff is because I have friends who are from Gaza or Palestine who were posting it constantly.
Yeah.
That's how I was keeping up with it. I wasn't certainly not through a news outlet that I was paying attention to. Okay, so here's the realist part, the realist question at the end of the day, because I've been the kid, the kid in a village with an M16 representing the U.S. government, who was 17 years old, right, in the military. That's not a super fun position to be in for anybody. It's not a super smart position for anybody to be in. But also, before I joined the military, as a skinhead punk rocker, I've been beat by police. My stepfather he's black, grew up under Jim Crow law in the South in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So no illusions about what was actually going on there. Before there were iPhones, I knew how police officers often treated a grown black man pulled over in Oklahoma, at least. So there's part of me that says, just the pure realist, not the theologian, not thinking about it pastorally, just this is what happens when you put these people in these situations with these narratives running through their heads. I don't know how it would turn out any other way. I mean, I have these kind of conversations with students, when they have a boyfriend or girlfriend. I'm like, well, yeah, if that's the setup, that's what the relationship is going to be like, right? There's not really any other way to go about it. So help me break up that block in my mind of okay, so what do we do when all of this seems so obvious? The more you understand the scenario, the more everything makes sense, but it doesn't make it any better. It just makes it worse in some ways because you get used to it, or just say, oh, well, that's just the way those people are over there. Those Middle Easterners, they're crazy, right? Because Americans are not, and we follow all those international laws and everything. Yeah. So thanks, Obama.
And I want to say that that police brutality or whatever example we want to bring up, that too happens in a social context. And in the global context of what's going on in Israel-Palestine, you have all kinds of aid and cover and protection by particularly the U.S. That tolerates this stuff. And I'm not qualified to address all of the various balancing forces at work here, and certainly it's far more complicated than I'll ever understand. But when you have a country like the U.S. giving it so much cover in terms of military hardware, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of the UN and the Security Council, you foster or you promote or you at least allow for the kind of things to happen that we're talking about. So yeah, you could say, well, yeah, boys will be boys, but no, there's going to be a school teacher, there's going to be a principal, there's going to be a society that says boys stop being boys. So I mean, that's just one comment that probably doesn't come across well, but I mean that the larger context can't be ignored. There's no guarantee that this is going to end well or justly. There's no guarantee that Palestinians are going to do any better than the North American Indian in the long run, 100 years from now. We don't know what the future holds. All we have is the present, and all we can do is say, we're going to kick against the darkness. We're going to resist. We're going to push for justice. A lot of the younger Palestinians these days have lost any real dream of a two-state solution. They really are more interested in human rights. They're interested, okay, you win Israel, here are the keys, you get everything, but now just give us our rights, give us, our protections, allow us to be, live out our lives in dignity. We want to get to school, we want to get to work, we want to be safe. Well, even that kind of scenario is looking less and less plausible or feasible given what's happened in the last 3 years. But I don't think because it's hard to picture a better future that gets us off the hook. Despair is the luxury of the privileged, right? And I'm one of those privileged old white dudes that doesn't face this on a daily basis. But I'm going to continue to push and continue to look for a solution, or to encourage the people involved to look for solutions that keep justice and human dignity at the center.
I would say two things here. One, yes, thanks to Dru for making that connection with the Jim Crow, and that's the thing. I think we need to interrogate the stories that we have been telling ourselves, especially in the U.S., about our goodness, our inherent goodness, and just look at the last 100 years, whether it's 150 years, whether it's slavery, whether it's segregation, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's like Catholics from Italy or Ireland coming to the U.S., Japanese, Chinese, you name it, right? There's always this bigotry towards this other who's different. Even a Catholic, who's not WASP enough, So you always had that legacy of dehumanization in this country, and we have to reckon with that legacy. We're better off than we were 50 years ago or 60 years ago, but that's that's a story that is true, and we need to emphasize it. But relatedly, my second point, if it was not for Christian Zionism and Christian support for Israel based on biblical reasons or otherwise, none of this would exist. This conflict would have ended. I'm reminded of the South African example. The apartheid in South Africa began in 1948, and the U.S. was supporting that system of apartheid. Right? It wasn't until the end of the 80s where some kind of laws were passed in Congress to, sanction and boycott South Africa. So it took the U.S. 40 years to say apartheid is wrong. So this is another chapter in that story of dehumanization of people. But Christian Zionism is a blight on the church, and I think we have to confront it. I get why Christians want to repent of anti-Semitism or supersessionism and want to come up and kind of be more affirming and be post-supersessionist or be philo-Semitic to support and love the Jewish people. But the thing is, that's great, and we can do it theologically in the academy. But what does it actually mean practically? And who are we replacing, right? We used to hate the Jewish people. Who do we hate right now? I'm kind of reminded by a quote from Gideon Levy, an Israeli journalist, who says, the Jews have become the new white man, and the Palestinian has become the new Jew. Now this is one people group that you can hate. So you replace Jews with white people. Now they become white, and now the Palestinians are the new Jews. So I think we have to reckon with the legacy of our seminaries, our scholarship, where we want to repent from supersessionism, that now we can justify the denial of human rights for the Palestinians and denial of justice, and also just turn a blind eye to the suffering of the Palestinians today. So there's work to be done in the academy, Dru, and that's why I think some of your work is really important, and the work Bruce is doing is really important. But also go down the list of the teachings at the sermons at churches. What you've been taught from Sunday school. Like when Ted Cruz is telling Tucker Carlson, "This is what I learned in Sunday school, Genesis 12. I need to support Israel." Well, his political ideology was developed at Sunday school. So we have also to confront that harmful ideology. That is not just bad theology. Like Christians are always we're good at making bad theology. We have a lot of bad theology, but the problem is now that this bad theology has real life impact and it's justifying evil. So this is I think this is the moment that this book wants to highlight for us. This is a pivotal moment in our faith, and we need to reckon with our complicity in evil, just like we had to reckon with our complicity in anti-Semitism, racism, and so on. This is one more iteration of that violence that is being justified by Christians.
Yeah, that's a really good flow of thoughts that brings us to, I have two questions. I want to get to Gen Z because I think the story is changing. Those are my kids' age, right? They're all 20-somethings. But of all the things that people don't know about the Middle East, one of them is people are shocked when you tell them simple things like, well, there's a whole border of Gaza against Egypt that is run by right-wing Muslim government, right? You have Jordan, you have Syria with its own problems. You have Saudi Arabia, right? Why? I mean, I've even heard, Middle Eastern experts just say out loud that all of these countries were quietly rooting for Israel against Gaza here. Why do you suppose the countries in the region have basically stepped away from holding Israel accountable for what they're doing in Gaza? I mean, I know that's a big geopolitical question, but it's kind of the one everybody in the region, kind of looks around and goes, yeah, why aren't you guys doing anything? You're just kind of sitting there watching with popcorn, it looks like.
Yeah, and there's lots of corruption, lots of complicity, lots of collusion, going back to 1948. And so there's lots of blame to go around, right? Many of these regimes are despotic, they're non-democratic. They may be more interested in trading with Israel than any kind of human rights agenda for their own people, much less for Palestinians. All of that is true. But is that on the shoulders of the Palestinian, right? I mean, is that therefore reason to sort of roll our eyes or shrug our shoulders and say, okay, this cause, needs to just, there's 22 other Arab nations, the Palestinians can just go, live somewhere else. I mean, that kind of language is so condescending and so Orientalist and so remarkable that it would never fly anywhere else in the world. But somehow that kind of lumping together of the Arab world flies in the comments on Israel-Palestine. But yeah, I don't think the Arab nations are doing any better than the West for the most part, with maybe a couple of exceptions. For the most part, sure, let's spread the blame around, but that doesn't solve the problem and it doesn't give us a path forward.
Right. Well,
yeah. Sorry, to jump in really quick. Yeah, I mean, I think it's laughable to say that Arab nations, or at least the people of these countries, are not pro-Palestine. It's very clear that they are. Many of these governments, like Bruce said, these are corrupt governments that want to appease the U.S. government. Jordan and Egypt have been pacified by the U.S. and they get billions of dollars annually from the U.S. to keep to their own. And someone like Jordan, both countries are very poor and they rely on that wealth, that money from the U.S. And that's part of the peace agreement they had signed with Israel. And for the sake of peace, they would get that money. So, but if you ask any Jordanian, any Egyptian, they have a very clear position. But also what is called the axis of resistance in the Middle East has been decimated. Think about the destruction of Iraq, think about Libya, think about Syria, and obviously a very corrupt and evil system you had in Syria, but also sanctions and so on. That was very, very. There's a lot of internal issues, obviously, in Syria at the time, but also was a very, economically and politically and militarily very destroyed. So you have a very weakened resistance movement against Israel. And of course, Israel remains as the one and only nuclear power in the Middle East, and Iran is seen as a threat. And of course, now you have this war with Iran. So there's been a very focused goal of Israel and by extension the US to pacify the region and to put it under the control of the US and Israel. But just to finish here, there's a very clear position that the neighboring countries have taken to normalize relations with Israel. There's the 2002 peace normalization plan by these countries saying, hey, we cannot fight Israel. We don't have their Apaches and their F-16s and the nuclear bombs, but we have a peace treaty. Hey, we would love to normalize relations as long as only insofar as you would set the Palestinians free and give them their own sovereignty and self-determination. That hasn't changed from these countries. Saudi Arabia, all of these countries are very clear on that position. Hopefully things would change and there would be a political will in Israel and in the US. To your point, Drew, there's a dramatic shift in the American opinion about Israel right now that could eventually lead to some kind of meaningful change in American foreign policy that could lead to that. But if there's no political will from the US, Israel is going to enjoy all the clout and all the power and all the wealth it's going to get from the US? Why would it stop? Why would it pursue justice if injustice brings it wealth and power? It's going to keep occupying and controlling. So this is not an issue with Arab countries. It's an issue of the power dynamics. And I'll finish with this side note to Bruce's point. Yeah, these are corrupt governments and governments in the Middle East. So what about the freedom-loving democratic countries in Europe? What have they done? Those who repented from anti-Semitism and said never again. Why would they allow it to happen again? So I would blame Germany more than I would blame a corrupt government like Jordan, for example.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So let's turn to those Gen Z. It's been fascinating. 2 reactions by Gen Z, and again, my kids are in this age, so I kind of try. My students are all in this age. One reaction is after October 7th, they didn't even know what Gaza was like. They just have no idea what's going on there, right? If they're Christian, maybe their church talks about Israel, again in this kind of very broadly positive way. And then the other one was almost equally naive. That eventually just became like this very anti-Israel, but there was no principle below it. It was just Israel bad. I mean, in some cases, because I was in New York City at the time, you saw people just Israel bad, Hamas good. And you're like, okay, we've left the world of reality. So, I'm now thinking about over the horizon as nuance develops in this next generation. And as they learn to think more theologically about this, what are the paths that you think need to be laid down for, what are the nodal points? Bruce, your microphone's doing that thing again. It's so wild. It just went, I don't know what's going on there. But I'm wondering what the paths are that you see can guide people into better rather than worse. And even the kinds of questions that, if you're a young person and you're growing into eldership or leadership in your church, what are the kinds of questions that you need to be asking your church now so they can begin thinking through these things afresh? In some ways, we have a new opportunity to think through all of this, right, because of the world events.
Some brief comments here. Just a side comment about the comparison between Israel and Hamas. While Hamas, we can agree as Christians, its ideology is problematic and it's violent and harmful. Any killing, targeting of civilians, and for me as a radical Christian pacifist, even targeting any human being is I cannot defend as a Christian. When I look at the cross, I cannot justify any kind of violence towards anyone. But I think if you want to compare Hamas to Israel, I think there's a very clear difference between a state that has been practicing terrorism and ethnic cleansing and apartheid legally by law against people, and between a military group that comes as a response to that system. There's a difference between Black Panther movements and Jim Crow. There's a difference between the ANC and apartheid. Mm-hmm. There is a difference between systemic violence that is entrenched in the system that has always been harming and killing people, and between the physical violence that we see on TV. So I think between the two, I think for me it's very obvious which is the more criminal, which one is the more violent or even evil. But and I'm happy to say both have committed awful things. But I think we have to understand the power dynamics, the structures of power.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
Yes.
And I'm pushing back only because of something that I think anybody who's seen these kind of things would think this was an obvious pushback. So I don't even know if I hold it to be true. When I lived in Israel-Palestine, you could tune in the radio station, from parts of the West Bank or from Gaza, right? You could see the television show, right? And everybody in Israel has seen these infamous Sesame Street knockoffs where they're teaching children to dress up as bombers and to stab the Jew here in the heart, not here, because this won't kill him. So you need to stab him here, right? Like this training. I think for most people, that's going to feel very different. Even if it's just a feeling, that feels very different than, kind of even a state-sponsored programmatic system where you're disenfranchising, committing violence, destroying property, etc. And I don't know how to disambiguate that. Because to me, it just feels different, and I don't know if that's justified or not. But I think that's what most people would push back and go like, no, Israel's not the worst person. Maybe they're equivalent, but not the worst.
I'm okay to work with equivalent. At least both are maintain some complexity and nuance, and they're not being flattened into bad versus good. But I would challenge that, Dru. Bruce, sorry, could you mute?
Sorry.
Yeah, Dru, I would challenge that a bit. I think I know that clip you're referring to. I grew up in Palestine. I'm a product of the Palestinian educational system. I've never experienced any of that. A lot of research has been done comparing the Palestinian educational systems and curricula with Israeli ones, and at best they're very similar. And at worst, the Israeli ones are way more harmful and way more violent. I can show you footage after footage of Jewish kids spitting on Palestinians, of Jewish kids, Israeli kids singing the killing of Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims, and in the classroom setting, on school trips in Israel. So I think you can find that clip from 20 years ago, but I think the data on the ground...
As an example, I'm speaking to Gazans directly that were telling me their experiences in Gazan schools.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I cannot speak. I cannot speak to that. I'm sure there would be a lot of anti-Israel, even anti-Semitic sentiment in Gaza for sure. But also, again, what is the context? If you have your boot on the neck of that person is not gonna be hunky dory with you. So again, we have to think of the system and what the system and how these awful feelings and anger and even anti-Semitism could develop, not because it's innate or because it's natural. It's as a byproduct of the structure that has, destroyed hope for equality, and then hate, violence becomes as a rational response to that.
Yeah.
So it's a very tragic reality. Like, I'm not disputing that point, Dru, but before we talk about these examples of what Palestinians have been doing or saying or putting on TV, we have to think about the structure that leads people to act in such a way.
Yeah. A good friend of mine, she actually studies curriculum in Israel, so I'll definitely have to ask her about. She would be aware and would not hold back if she thought there was a difference. Bruce, you want to hop in here with your super loud microphone that hopefully we'll fix in post?
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, so I thought you were going to go to maybe the campus demonstrations in the U.S. Not long ago that arose in response to Israel's behavior in Gaza. And, we all know college students, you have them in your home. But these kids, as far as I think we can tell, we're not necessarily that well informed. But one thing that marks this generation is that they're pretty reluctant to support various kinds of human rights abuses. They have friends who are gay, they have friends who are Muslim, they have friends who are whatever, and they stand in solidarity with people that are on the edges, people that are marginalized. And so one of the things that was happening in those campus demonstrations were these kids recognizing the kind of marginalization and injustice and crying out against the perpetrator. And that, of course, gets narrated in many different ways, but one of the ways it gets narrated is that it's anti-Semitic. You can't be anti-Israel without being anti-Semitic. And of course, every demonstration is going to have its fringe figures, but my sense is that the Jewish and non-Jewish kids in most of the campus demonstrations were not driven by some kind of deep-rooted hatred of Jews. They were driven by what they saw on TikTok or whatever that looked to them like mass killing and mass injustice. And so my hat is off to them if what they see are human beings around the world rather than, groups, nations, partisan bodies, tribes. I hope that's the way of the future as they grow up, that they see us more as fellow humans on this planet than as tribes that are in, perpetual competition.
Yeah, and I think that they, and as a whole, my read on them as a whole is that they are much more sympathetic to people who used to be on the margins or traditionally put on the margins socially and otherwise, and they do have more access to information than any young generation before them as well. And so you have that combination. And I agree a lot. Again, in New York City, I think a lot of it was very uninformed or underinformed. but it was that kind of gut instinct, that gut reaction to what was happening. And I think it's fair to say, anytime you have that kind of resistance, public protest or resistance, people with bad intentions and bad theology are going to also get in there and co-opt it as well, and stoke flames and that stuff. So we shouldn't be surprised by any on any situation, whether that was the pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian protest, etc. Okay, well, I do want to go back to this thing that I was asking for. That how do we guide these people? I have I work with college students every year, a new batch. How do we guide them forward? Like, what are the things as Christians they absolutely need to be thinking about? Right now, it's Israel and Palestine. Who knows what views are going to be 10 years from now? I mean, I quit guessing I can call balls and strikes on what's going to happen in this part of the world. But how do we future-proof them to think more clearly about what is now the nation state of Israel in regard to their Christianity?
I've been teaching at Notre Dame for 2 years now, and get to spend a lot of time with these students. And it's interesting to see what's happening and how they think about this issue. Some of them are influenced by Nick Fuentes and very hateful and anti-Semitic stuff that is making them anti-Israel as well. And I agree with Bruce. Some of them are just motivated by concern for justice and peacemaking, and kind of refusing kind of American kind of propensity to be at war, and some of them are just driven by this kind of America First, ideology. That why are we wasting our money in the Middle East and so on, or killing the troops and putting them in danger, whatever. And some, of course, are driven by this kind of concern for international law and human rights and equality and so on. So all of these things are at play. So it's interesting to see how that's gonna move forward. But something that I've been trying to emphasize, which has been also concerning for me, was to see that kind of the special interest in Christian Palestinians vis-a-vis or against a Muslim. And there's a special kind of tribalism that many Christians fall into. Something that we've done as Palestinian Christians is like, hey, guys, look at us Christians in the land. Pay attention to what we're dealing with. It's legitimate, but it's tribal. It works, but it still feeds into that narrative of we don't care about Muslims. And the vast majority of Palestinians are Muslims. So when you're emphasizing the minority, there's a bit of just unease I have towards it, because it's not challenging the inherited, like I said before, the inherited apathy or even hostility towards Muslims and Arabs. So I think that's kind of my appeal to Christians, just to adopt a very Christocentric attitude of loving the neighbor in a very radical way. I think the example of the parable of the Good Samaritan is a powerful narrative to share. And if you go to the Sermon on the Mount, the constitution of God's kingdom on earth, to love our neighbors and to love our enemies, and He brought them together. The law of the Hebrew Bible is to love the neighbor, and that neighbor was understood in racial, religious sense. That's the Jewish neighbor. But then Christ kind of radicalized that and says, no, actually, the neighbor is a Samaritan, and the Samaritan could be a neighbor to you if you just think about it. But also loving of the enemy. This is this is one of the clearest commandments, I think, from Jesus, from Matthew 5, but it's the hardest to follow, especially, again, because of our culture, that we are trained to always hate the enemies and kill them and destroy them. So this is like the biggest tragedy, I think, for our witness as Christians, that we just don't take Jesus seriously. We think Jesus is weak when He says love the enemy. So there's a radical teaching of Jesus that is antithetical to our culture. And I'm just kind of concerned for young Christians from Gen Zers and others who are motivated by hostility, for tribalism, even antisemitism, but are not driven by radical love. So that's kind of my hope for us, is to unearth that beautiful prophetic tradition that began in the Hebrew Scriptures and continued through Christ, of that radical pursuit of justice and mercy, and loving of neighbor. And if we do this is going to be easy. It's not really that hard. If you see the Palestinian as your neighbor, you're not going to stand idly. You're going to do something about it. So yeah, that's kind of my hope for younger generations to realize that. I am hopeful. There is, for the first time in history, more Americans are more sympathetic to Palestinians. Sadly, it took a genocide for people to wake up. It's really sad that so many of us have to be slaughtered for Christian Americans to wake up. If your audience is evangelical, or the majority of them are evangelical, evangelicals are lagging behind as usual with these issues. So there's a lot of work to be done in evangelical spaces as well, especially because of our theology. Shameless plug here. I kind of would encourage people to look into the work that we are doing as Palestinian Christians through the Bethlehem Institute for Peace and Justice, Palestinian Christian theologians and leaders who are kind of speaking up. I think this is a really important time in history in our faith, and I think it behooves a lot of us in the West to kind of come alongside our siblings in Palestine, work alongside them, walk alongside them, visit them, spend time with them, but also speak up about what's happening, and also spend time at least in learning and listening, and hopefully that would transform the way that they think about this issue.
I will push back because I'm a Hebrew Bible person.
Hey, okay.
Love your neighbor as yourself is the beginning. It goes on to say, love the foreigner as yourself, for you were once foreign, which is what Jesus is doing with the Good Samaritans, is showing he knows Leviticus. But
no, totally. I think
still reinforces your point.
How was it understood? I think in the first century is a bit different.
Right.
But totally, I think the Hebrew Scripture is rich in this very expansive vision of the neighbor, of the poor, of the orphan, totally, and the stranger. So,
and the fact that he could say, "You have heard, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy," and nobody balked at it, means that was
exactly
it was the meaning to most people there. Bruce, you want to hop in here and give us a final thought?
Let me add two things. Thanks, Daniel, for those comments. Your final comment about sort of paying attention to the Palestinian community, it's been really delightful for me over the last 25 years to watch young voices emerge, including Daniel's. And there's really a lot to offer there coming out of the Palestinian community, many based in the Bethlehem area, but some are taking posts in places like Notre Dame. There's a lot to listen to and to learn from. And that's part of the broader concern I have for this Gen Z crowd that we're talking about. And that is that they need to be encouraged to listen to the global South, as we call it, or to voices outside of their bubble, their North American bubble. Not all of those voices are going to steer them in the right direction. There's an awful lot of Christian Zionism in the global South that's very much driven by prosperity theology and the notion that if we bless Israel, God is going to make our country and ourselves prosperous. That's rampant in Latin America, where I live, and elsewhere. But there are many voices and perspectives that they need to be introduced to. And of course, we could talk a long time about that. The other comment I would just make finally is just to kind of point out that in the binary world that we see, particularly in the U.S., but not just in the U.S., a lot of it is infected by the toxin of certitude, it seems to me. This idea that I see clearly, and the binary is, of course, between me and God on one side, and you and the enemy, the devil, on the other. My views are correct, yours are flawed, and I'm not going to even waste time listening to yours. That kind of certitude, or you could say hubris, goes all the way up and down the food chain in the Christian church. And we need something like epistemic humility to take over and take its place, where we recognize that we don't see things clearly, that we have things to learn, that I have things to learn from people in my own country that have different stories, that I have things to learn from people in Israel and Palestine. And if we can somehow discourage them from settling into sort of that binary thinking that is so much a part of our culture, I think they're going to be more likely to be able to learn from those around them and proceed in humility along the lines that Daniel was suggesting.
And I'm going to give a plug, an amen plug on that. I'm an ambassador for Langham Partnership. So if you want to get started reading some majority world scholars who are doing some fantastic work, they have a whole library of books they publish from majority world scholars, and who I have made lots of friendships and learned lots of things from that I would have never learned from someone stuck in North America. Yes, very good. In a final note, besides Bethlehem Institute for Justice and Peace,
Peace and Justice,
Peace and Justice. Sorry. Anybody you think that is doing this well from the pro-Israel, and pro-Palestine. I hope we're all pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian in meaningful ways, right? But do you think there's anybody from the typical pro-Israel side who's doing some of this well? They're actually involving Palestinian voices. They want to support Israel and whatever that means, but they are not neglecting their Palestinian neighbors.
Yeah, there are fantastic groups. From the Christian side, it's very limited. I've been part of many conversations and trips and meetings with Messianic Jews, so Jews who believe in Jesus, and those conversations never went forward, mostly for a lot of reasons. But I think there's a lot of kind of ideology among Messianic Jews, especially because of the official position of the government and denial of certain rights, and some of them even were stripped of their citizenship because the court found them to be Christians and not Jews. So they stripped them from so they tend to be more protective and more quote unquote Zionist. So that kind of made it hard for us to kind of see eye to eye. At the same time, I had been very active with a peace camp in Israel. A lot of fantastic organizations doing work, joint Palestinians and Israelis within Israel. So Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis, and also those in Israel who come to the West Bank and join us in protests, act as human shields to protect us from the Israeli military. There are groups like, and I'm sure Bruce is aware of some organizations as well, some groups like Standing Together, Combatants for Peace, and so on. They're doing some phenomenal work, working alongside Palestinians. There's also the Parents Circle, Palestinians and Israeli circles coming together. There's also Roots, Judur in Arabic. It's a joint Israeli-Palestinian initiative active in the West Bank and Israel proper. In the U.S., we have an incredible number of Jewish rabbis and scholars and theologians who are doing that work. Even within Jerusalem, you have these anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Orthodox communities that are now becoming more. Some of them are kind of strange, but some of them are like, wait, we actually stand with Palestinians now. Of course, very problematic in many ways. There's
all kinds of interesting groups there.
Yeah, there are in diaspora in the U.S., Jewish communities have been very active in standing for Palestinians, Reformed, Orthodox, Reconstructionist. All of them have been doing some really cool work. So grateful for that as well. So.
Yeah.
Just to add one name to that litany, and I have other groups I could mention, but when we were thinking about the title of the book that we just edited, just January of that year, 2025, Peter Beinart's book came out, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. And when I read that book, and I've listened to Peter Beinart many times, he's a practicing modern Orthodox Jew out of New York with a very high profile and a gentle and thoughtful man who will listen to and talk to anybody. I said, he's asking his Jewish community to do something very difficult, to think about how they should conceive of themselves and maybe how they've wrongly conceived of themselves leading up to what happened after Gaza, after October 7th. And so we kind of riffed on his title. And so when we came up with ours, it was Being Christian After the Desolation of Gaza. We changed that part, but it was really kind of a little bit of a tip of the hat to his work. And we are trying to do something similar in the Christian community. But he's just an example of somebody. Of course, he draws a lot of fire. He gets a lot of criticism. But he's been, he made a turn. He was a devout Zionist for years, and then abandoned that position because he saw where that Zionism was going and he couldn't follow it. But he's a synagogue attending, praying, Torah studying Jewish scholar in New York, who I just look to as a wonderful model of how to dialogue and how to challenge his own tribe, his own people, and we're trying to do something similar. So just a shout out to Peter Beiner.
That's really helpful, and I saw him mentioned several times, and I went and looked at that book because of the mentions in here. Real quick, because I didn't quite get an answer, I'm trying to figure out what you call somebody who's an Israeli, but they just want to live in the land, and they want to live with Palestinians, but they believe that they should be able to live there as well. What do we call them if not a Zionist? Do we have a good catchphrase for that? Just practically speaking.
Human?
A mensch? Yeah, well, literally a mensch. Yeah,
you can live in the land as long as your attitude is of equality and democracy. I don't care what name you want to give, we can give you. But if your ideology puts yourself and your ethnicity and your religion above others, whatever name you want to give it, that's a wrong ideology, and we have to dismantle it. So I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, I don't have a name either. As Daniel said early in the conversation, Jews, Muslims, and Christians have been in the land for centuries. So it's just more of the same. They were under the boot of various empires, sure, but they were coexisting and, with tensions. But then, by and large, it was really the Christians who were the hardest on the Jews by far, much more than the Muslims. And so whatever they're called, the friends of mine that I know in Jerusalem and in Israel proper, who are wanting to be there as part of their heritage, and maybe they were born there, that's the land they know, but they're deeply troubled by what their state and their government is doing, and even what their society is promoting. They feel responsibility, and they lie awake at night, and they work hard, and they carry a very heavy burden, because it's hard to be a Jew who's critical of the system right now. They're brothers and sisters on this planet who do have a heritage and do have good reasons why they might want to be there. But it's the terms, right? It's on what basis and at whose expense. Those are the questions that we have to worry about.
That's a good place to end it. I didn't get to read all the essays, but the 4 or 5 that I read were very good and very well written and challenging, and I had to stop and think at many points. I have to say, I lived in Jerusalem for 6 months, and I was in my 30s with kids and thought, well, now I get to live here for 6 months and I get to travel back and forth for the next couple of years. I'm going to figure out I'm going to get to the bottom of this whole thing. And I have to say, every day I live there and every trip that I've ever been on back to the land, I have more and more questions and less answers. And so it bothers us even more when we hear somebody go, they just need to do X, right? And you're like, oh, okay, that's cute. They do lots of things need to be done, but it's never one thing. I think
at this point, Drew, just to emphasize this, I think instead of pointing the fingers at people, maybe us Christians need to do the work. Maybe we are the ones who are part of the problem, and we need to fix our hearts and our minds before we do anything and say anything else.
Well, I think the book helps do some of that excavation, because I think a lot of us are just not thinking about most of the things going on at this point. I thank you very much for taking all of this time, straight from Peru and all the way from Indiana as well. But really appreciate it, and I appreciate the book.
Thank you, Drew.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.